Welcome to Spirit Grooves. My name is Michael Erlewine, and this segment follows one called Recognition in this series on mixing the mind, about merging meditation practice with the outside world. The whole thing was a little like trying to erect a large circus tent in the middle of my mind, struggling to push up massive tent poles to stretch and raise the canvas until I had some, what I could only call mental room to just look around in there. So it was hard work, for these mental muscles had perhaps never been exercised before. As silly as it seemed to me, I even began looking to see if my mind actually was red or some other color, whether my mind was located in my head, in my heart, or my belly, and so on. Of course, the answers were all negatives, just as I'd always thought, but in the process I was up and somehow walking around in there, getting to know the place a bit, and so it went. Was that what Rinpoche wanted us to do? Where before I had kind of mentally slept through this kind of questioning, now I was at least going through it through the motions, getting some exercise. I was also following the instructions from my teacher, which I had so conveniently ignored up to that point, because I thought these questions went without asking. Instead, I was asking them now, asking them again, doing exactly what Rinpoche was requesting us to do, and that little bit of exercise began to open up doors for me. And it went on like this for days, as Rinpoche very carefully led us into actually looking at our minds. And I was finally following along. These simple exercises, along with the fact that apparently by this time I had done enough practice over the years, or somehow managed to accumulate enough merit, or whatever it was that I needed, so that I actually was able to recognize or get at least a small glimpse of the true nature of that mind. And it was not what I had expected. There was no lightning bolt. It's more like an exclamation point. Needless to say, it was nothing like I had led myself to believe all these years. Of course, my expectations were whatever I had managed to distill from books and the teachings. This mixed with the tales of other practitioners, friends, and then sealed with my personal take on things. In other words, kind of a jumble. Like most of us learning this, my preconceptions had managed to thoroughly cloud and obscure an otherwise cloudless sky, as the Tibetans say. At this point, it's worthwhile to backtrack and take a little closer look at what I had been expecting all this time. And this is really important. It is said in the Mahamudra teachings that the main and perhaps only function of the teacher, of the guru, is to point out to the student the true nature of his or her mind. After that, it's up to the student. The nature of the mind, quote unquote. This phrase immediately raises expectations that are reminiscent of the realm of like Zen koan, those kind of dramas. One thing I never had managed to understand is that recognizing the nature of the mind is not the same as enlightenment, whatever that was. So let's start there, and this is really important. What is meant by the phrase recognizing the nature of the mind, as I understand it, is more like being able to finally see the actual problem that I was having with meditation all along. Like, I had no idea what it was, and I found that embarrassing. After having some recognition, I then saw that the nature of the mind is not something beyond my current reach, as I'd always implicitly assumed, but rather more like very simply seeing how the mind actually worked. Seeing that the mind, my mind, was in fact workable, as in, hey, I might be able to do this. I finally could see a little into how I might work it. And being a bit of a clever guy, this was a very practical revelation. This is what seeing the true nature of the mind is all about. It's a new take on practice, not some euphoric rush of bliss or enlightenment. Perhaps the most important result of recognition is that the responsibility for getting enlightened immediately switched from the books, texts, and whatever my teacher told me. What I saw or recognized made me responsible, and only me. That had never happened before. I was always looking for someone or something on the outside strong enough to affect me and somehow enlighten me. Well, it doesn't come from outside. And as obvious as it sounds now, I could see that this was never going to happen. And I could now see why. Only I could enlighten myself. It's Buddha's whole point. It was my job, not someone else's. In pointing out the nature of the mind to me, and my getting a little bit of the gist of it, Rinpoche had completed his responsibility to me and succeeded in making me fully responsible for the first time. And I actually responded. But with that responsibility also came the insight on how this mind training business could be done. When I originally read in the classic texts about seeing the nature of the mind, I assumed and expected some grand fireworks-like display, and that I would be immediately transported into some transcendental state of illumination, enlightenment or something like that. Whatever I had imagined all these years. Expectations are seldom ever our friend, and almost always manage to obscure the actual path and the reality. It might be better to say that the teacher points out the nature of how the mind works, rather than simply say the teacher points out the nature of the mind. The quote, nature of the mind, unquote, seems so mysterious, and the actuality is anything but that. In my case, the less that's left to the imagination, the better. My imagination had filled me with preconceptions and impossible expectations all my life. In other words, at least in my recognition, the aha experience was not, aha, this is finally some enlightenment, but rather a simple, ah, I get it now. So this is how the mind works. Even a beginner like me can do that. This is actually workable, something that I could actually do. It's remarkable how in that instant my years of expectations just vanished and were replaced by something simply practical that finally made real sense, something I understood. How absolutely encouraging that was. The pointing out instructions didn't in any way mark the end of my practice, and my graduation to some higher bodhisattva-like level, like I'd always wondered or imagined, but rather it pointed to the end of my imitating what it is that I thought practice was supposed to be, and the very beginning of actual useful practice. Finally, I got the general idea of how to work with my mind, and I understood in a flash that I had been mistaken about this all of my Dharma life, like perhaps 30 years. For the first time, I saw simply how the mind works, and that there was no reason at all that I, just as I am, warts and all, could not just do it. And that was a new experience, to somehow be at the same level with reality and to see it clearly. It was up to me to figure out just how to work with this new information, and I had to put the time in. Perhaps most important of all, I suddenly had some enthusiasm, energy to make it work, and this I had been missing. So suddenly no more boredom and laziness when it came to practice. I was enthused. And while the fact of recognition was less exotic than what I had mistakenly expected, it was perhaps, if my opinion counts, the first tangible result of many, many years of practice. And it was not just a passing experience, but a simple realization as to what had to happen next. Like, when you realize how something works, you just get it. You don't forget, because it's not a simple experience, but a recognition. That quite ordinary insight was a form of recognition, and it was permanent. It was there to stay. In reality, for me, this was a huge result after about 31 years of meditation of the, quote, sounds like this, unquote, variety. Years during which I sincerely went through the motions, but with little result that I could see. I'd been rubbing the sticks and getting some heat, but no fire. Suddenly, there was some heat and also fire. While not what I expected, this was what I had always dreamed about having happen. Visible progress. The mind was suddenly workable, and all I had to do was to work it. And I could see that even I could do it. After perhaps 30 years, I actually understood something about meditation. No, it was not the enlightenment revelation I had in my expectations, and it was not the thunderbolt from above, not something beyond this world of samsara, but something much more down to earth, something already very close to me. The nature of my mind, that is, how my mind works and how I can work with it. After all of my years of theoretical practice, things finally got practical, and therefore real practice could begin. Nevertheless, as minimal as my realization was, it brought about a profound change in my approach to meditation. I left that year's 10-day teaching with a very different idea as to what my practice was going to be about from then on. For one, it was now crystal clear to me that the amount of daily practice I had been able to squeeze out up to that time would never be enough to get me to any kind of enlightened state. It was like going to church only on Sunday. Being the devious, lazy, bad boy that I am, I would never get to heaven at that rate. I had never been that much of an angel anyway, more like the black sheep of my family, and that too was a problem. I could now see that mind practice required way more effort than the small amount of practice I had been doing each day, which practice itself I had nickel and dime to death as it was. It seemed that everything else in my life managed to come first, managed to distract me from my Dharma practice, and on top of that, my whole approach to practice was cloaked in expectations, disappointment, and frugality on my part of effort. At that point in my life, I was doing as little actual practice as I could get away with and still look at myself in the mirror. Basically, I was worn out. Worst of all, practice was not a joyful affair for me. It was something I just did and continue to do, sometimes only because to not do it at all would be more horrible than the pain of actually doing it. I could not even consider the consequences of just stopping practice altogether, although I was very tired of it. Quitting was just too scary. The Dharma was so much a part of my ego, my identity, for me just to stop practicing. If I wasn't a Dharma practitioner, what the heck was I doing with my life? But what now I realized was that, like it or not, my daily practice, even in the best of times, had been simply way too small an effort to ever get very far along my personal Dharma path. Even at the best of times, the most practice I had ever done was around 2 hours a day in one stretch. And even that much practice would probably not be enough to clear away the various obscurations I managed to collect. I needed some full-time Dharma practice, and I was a part-time player. One thing I did realize from the pointing out instructions was that all of my years chained to the computer as a programmer had given me a real ability to concentrate, and for long hours at a time. That was not all bad. I often would work 12 or even 14 hours a day, glued to the tube, as they say. And although the computer work might not be particularly dharmic in nature, the concentration I had acquired was quite real, lacking perhaps only a more pure motive than making money. Although that's not really fair to me. In my life, I've always turned my hobbies into ways of making money. So mostly I loved what I did for a living, and I did it with a pure heart. If only I could tackle Dharma with the concentration and enthusiasm that I put into my various computer and entrepreneurial projects. I had been thinking and dreaming about this for years. The pointing out instructions I had received from Khenpo Kata Rinpoche and the resulting technique it inspired and made possible was something that actually stood up very well off the cushion, that is, in everyday life, what is called post-meditation. I slowly began to apply the techniques of mind training that I was learning to what I was doing on the computer as a job all day long. During my computer work, whenever I would catch myself in a distraction, that means when I popped out of whatever I was deeply involved in and found myself once again outside of my concentration and just looking around, at those times I would attempt to practice Mahamudra meditation. It could be as simple as a dog barking, or a phone call, the doorbell, and an unwelcome thought, and so on. Whatever it took to startle me out of what I was concentrating on. The result was that I was suddenly forced out of whatever I had been focused on and just instantly there, awake. Those gaps in my concentration were the only moments I had to insert Dharma into my work. But there were a lot of them. And it was in those gaps or moments that I would remember to look at the nature of my mind, or at the nature of the thought that I was having. In the beginning, this was only momentary glimpses, brief glances at the nature of a thought, at the nature of the mind. But I persevered. After all, I had virtually nothing better to do with my time anyway. So whenever I found myself startled or popping out of whatever I was engrossed in, I would take that opportunity to at least try and look at the nature of my mind, and to then rest in that true nature as much as I could. Anyway, I was gradually exercising the mind. I had seen the nature of my own mind, something about how it worked, which, as I mentioned, does not mean I was enlightened in any way, only that I had seen something about how the mind actually worked, or how it was, and even that tiny look was enough to begin unraveling some of my obscurations that I had labored under all my life. And I liked what I saw, and was beginning to learn to rest a bit in the nature of the mind, however brief that was. These moments of resting were short, perhaps more like nanoseconds, rather than something more enduring. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Spirit Grooves. If you'd like to read further on awareness, please see my free ebooks on astrologyland.com. Look for the book link in the middle of the page. My name is Michael Erlewine, and I curate what is probably the largest library of astrology in the world, the Heart Center Library. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Spirit Grooves, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.